Salaway, and welcome back to the Everything History podcast for episode 36, The Reemergence of Cleopatra and the Sicilian Revolt. This episode picks up right after the double suicide of Brutus and Cassius and the victory of Octavian and Antony at Philippi. The Second Triumvirate now had control over the entire Roman Republic, or so it seemed, for in this episode the historical narrative of the great Augustus will reveal the instability still present across the Roman world. The fighting was not even close to being at an end, and the union between the three triumvirs begins to fray as old hatreds and animosities return.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
In the aftermath of the Battle of Philippi, the Roman Republic was reeling. People of all walks of life were uncertain about the future of the Republic, about whether they should be happy or depressed, and uncertain about their own futures. The people generally held such thoughts to themselves for fear of what might happen if their words reached the wrong set of ears. After Philippi, though, Octavian and Antony attempted to restore order to the troubled Republic. They conducted great sacrifices, praised the valor of their soldiers, and the two triumvirs separated once more across the Republic in order to reinstate order and assuade the populace that war was over. Octavian traveled to Italia, settling his veteran soldiers in colonies as he went, and Antony went further east to the provinces of Asia, Syria, Judea, and the client kingdom of Egypt in order to show the control and law of the three triumvirs and prove to them that Brutus and Cassius were no more. The East took little convincing once Antony arrived and news spread of Philippi. Antony gathered many of the eastern leaders in the city of Pergamon, a very symbolic spot because Pergamon had been bequeathed to the Romans some 90 years prior in 133 BCE. In Pergamon, Antony addressed the dire situation and gave clemency to almost all. Only those that had directly been involved in Caesar's death were punished. Indeed, even those who had joined Brutus and Cassius's armies and opposed the triumvirs were given mercy. Which is probably why Antony was the one conducting affairs in the East, because Octavian was far less merciful. He might well have killed quite a few. That is a theoretical thought, though, and Octavian always had a tendency to do the unexpected, so who knows. At Pergamon, though, Antony still had to deal with reorganization and finances, a very difficult task. Appian tells us that the Greeks, and for that matter the rest of the assembled leaders and envoys, threw themselves at the feet of Antony and begged for forgiveness. They reminded Antony that although they had helped Brutus and Cassius, they had not done so willingly. They wished to offer gifts and donatives to the triumvirs, but Brutus and Cassius had sucked them dry. They had no coins and not even any metalware left in their cities, and they told Antony of how some cities had even been subject to destruction or wholesale slavery. These words were quite true, although hyperbolic in some senses. But Antony nevertheless was sympathetic to their situation and began to reinstate law, order, and taxation on a case-by-case basis. He pardoned the city of Ephesus and gave them extra time to pay their taxes and donatives, and Antony even released certain cities from taxation temporarily. For example, the Lycians were granted exemption, the Rhodians were given more territory and villages, and Antony sought out funds to rebuild cities such as Xanthos. Antony proceeded in such matters as he made his way around the east until a fateful meeting in the province of Silesia. Silesia is located in southern Anatolia, the coastal territory just northeast of Cyprus. And it was there that Antony first met Cleopatra. The famous union of Antony and Cleopatra would of course follow, but their first meeting was about administration. Antony demanded her submission to Rome and censured her and all of Egypt for their lack of assistance to the triumvirate's war and cause. Cleopatra, ever graceful, was not intimidated by Antony and explained her kingdom's past and current predicament, stating that Egypt had been plagued by famine, and after Cassius had defeated Dolabella, Egypt had only a fleet, no armies left to use. Cleopatra beseeched Antony, arguing that she had intended to send her fleet to he and the young Caesar, but Brutus had made this impossible by positioning troops in nearby Syria and threatening the destruction of her people. But, Cleopatra said, she was here now to submit herself and kingdom to Antony and Rome. Marc Antony was amazed at Cleopatra's intelligence, and even from this very first meeting was quite taken with her. Make no mistake, Cleopatra knew what she was doing. She was highly intelligent and frighteningly influential. Shortly after this meeting in Silesia, Antony and Cleopatra would begin their fateful relationship for better or worse. But allow me to halt there for a moment. I need to address the history of Antony and Cleopatra, meaning I need to explain what we do know and, more importantly, what we do not know about the two lovers. We do know that they fell into some sort of relation shortly after the meeting at Silesia, but we do not know how this came to be, where it started, or when exactly it started. We also do not know if their romance consisted of love or lust. Most likely it was a combination, like most relationships, but I would argue that there was definitely love outside of physical passion between Antony and Cleopatra, because they did stay together for a little longer than a decade, and the union only stopped due to their deaths. We also, of course, know that the two had children together, and that Antony began this romantic and power affair while married to his Roman wife Fulvia. Their children were Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene II, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Alexander was the eldest and seems to have been born around 41 to 40 BCE. Of course, Cleopatra also had the son of Julius Caesar, Caesarion, as well. All of these details will become extremely important later. Another factor I must note about Antony and Cleopatra is that the ancient historians unanimously recognize Cleopatra as manipulative and as a borderline evil sorceress. Now, spoilers here, but Octavian defeats them both, so he had control of those writing the history. And considering there isn't a scrap of evidence praising Cleopatra outside of her clever intelligence, it seems likely that Octavian successfully destroyed Cleopatra's reputation for all time. The honest truth, though, surrounding Cleopatra and her relations with Antony is lost to us, but it is quite clear that Octavian despised them both, and you will see how the younger Caesar uses Cleopatra against Antony politically a little bit later on. That is all to come later, however, so after the fateful meeting in Silesia, Antony attempted to form a military expedition against the Parthian Empire. Antony's logic was that Parthia had taken advantage of Rome's temporary weakness by attacking Rome's Syrian and Judaic provinces. He may have also been hoping to avenge the loss of Crassus and his legions over a decade prior. This expedition was formed around 41 BCE, but Antony had ignored the illogical aspects of such a campaign. Primarily the glaring fact that Rome and the East had just gotten out of a massive war, were still recovering, and had no money. So the campaign naturally sputtered out with no gains, and Antony retreated to Alexandria and Cleopatra in early 40 BCE. That last bit intrigued Octavian quite a lot. Speaking of Octavian, let's rewind the clock to detail what he was doing from 42 to 40 BCE. Well, as I had mentioned earlier, he had moved his forces back to Italia and began the process of creating military colonies for his veteran soldiers. A colony of this sense is where Roman veterans who had served a certain length of time or for a certain campaign were rewarded with farmland and other rewards of property. So as you might imagine, this is a very complicated business, and Octavian set about finishing the task in early 42 BCE, and it took several years. And Octavian proved once again that he was highly exceptional at such administrative matters. Yes, in the next 2 years, Octavian settled several thousand veteran legionnaires in various cities and locations throughout Italia, although several legions decided to stay on in service to Octavian himself, and these men were formed into highly skilled praetorian cohorts that Octavian kept close to himself. There were several problems, however, for Octavian as he settled his legions. The chief problem were the soldiers themselves, because the legions were aware that they were essential to the triumvir's power, and that this gave them leverage. So the soldiers used this leverage over Octavian and the government to not only get their due rewards, but to take whatever they wanted. So many thousands of the veterans decided that they did not just want new land for their colonies, they wanted villas and highly valuable property of other people. The soldiers then began to forcibly take the estates of Roman patricians and equestrians all along the coast of eastern Italia, and Octavian had no other choice but to let them, because Octavian needed the support of the armies. And as a side note, the deal between the legions and the triumvirs was that if they, the soldiers, were duly rewarded for their service, then they would continue to serve the triumvirs. So the army's obedience was essential to everything. The historian Appian actually describes the situation quite well, saying, quote, The chiefs depended on the soldiers for the continuance of the government, while the soldiers depended on the permanence of the government for the lands and possessions they had just been given. End quote. Now you can see that the government needed the soldiers and vice versa. The government in this case was almost exclusively Octavian Caesar at this point. And actually that was entirely on purpose, because Octavian wanted to be the soldiers' sole benefactor, because then the soldiers would be loyal to him alone if and when war broke out again. And Octavian's plan worked like a charm, for Appian writes, quote, Octavian made many other gifts to the indignant soldiers, for which the affections of the army were turned towards him, and greater thanks were bestowed upon him alone, as the giver of land, cities, money, houses, and as the one leader who bore this chore consistently for the army's sake. End quote. So suffice it to say, Octavian had the full support of the Roman armies, and this became so obvious that Marc Antony's brother and wife, Lucius and Fulvia respectively, sought to disturb Octavian's stranglehold on the army's loyalty. They feared that as Antony was off in the east, that Octavian would grow too strong, and that the young Caesar was seeking to undermine Antony's power in Rome, and right they were. And they went so far in their pursuit of Antony's interest that Lucius Antonius, who was a staunch Republican and the consul, came to war with Octavian. By pitting the legions of his brother against the legions of Octavian, Lucius hoped that this conflict would serve as a proxy war for Antony. But Octavian did not let it. He treated it as an internal war over governmental affairs, and reminded the people continually that he had no animosity or poor intentions against his colleague Marc Antony, who everyone knew was busy in Alexandria. And the rumors in the news about Antony said that Marc Antony was too preoccupied anyways with Cleopatra's groins to think of Italia at all. This helped Caesar, and Octavian also brought his longtime friend Marcus Agrippa to help command his armies. Caesar and Agrippa proved, and would continue to prove, to be a powerful team. They defeated Lucius at the siege of Perugia, and squashed the civil conflict before word even reached Antony of the war involving his family in Italia. Octavian was hailed as Imperator, and gave mercy to Lucius and his colleagues, but Octavian did execute scores of senators that had sided with Lucius. And in the aftermath of the war, Octavian successfully seized control of the provinces of Hispania and Gaul, and sent Lepidus to Africa. Caesar also made the province of Cisalpine Gaul independent of any triumvir's authority like that of Italia. Thus Octavian had deprived Antony and Lepidus of several provinces, and he had now firmly established himself in the Roman West. But not everything was going well for Octavian, though. Despite all of Octavian's moves, Antony remained a very popular figure. This was an issue that Octavian began to devise a solution for as early as 4140 BCE, because if he was going to struggle for power against Antony, he needed to find a way to make the people hate Antony. But the more pressing problem of Octavian's was Sextus Pompey. Remember him? Last time I mentioned Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey, otherwise known as Pompeius, he had taken control of large sections of Sardinia and Sicily. By 40 BCE, his power and annoyance to the larger Roman state had grown. He now fully controlled those two islands and had amassed a sizable navy and even an army from the remnants of the defeated forces of Brutus and Cassius. Sextus Pompey's navy had become a substantial fleet and was known for piracy throughout the Mediterranean Sea, which is somewhat ironic because Pompeius' father had been praised by the Senate for wiping out piracy in Roman waters. This was Octavian's greatest threat in the oncoming years because it was a nearby and potent military threat to the Roman West. In addition to Octavian's growing problem of Sextus Pompey, Antony discovered everything that had occurred in Italia during his absence. He was furious and made his way for Italia at once, but where his fury was directed was unknown. He admonished his brother and wife for disturbing the peace, actually admonishing his wife Fulvia so harshly that she went into a bit of a psychological breakdown. Fulvia, who suffered already from jealousy of Cleopatra, suffered even further with a great illness until she died some weeks later. Antony would learn of her fate later. In the meantime, though, he made haste for the Italian coastal city of Brundisium with an army. Antony arrived and found the city shut to him. This perplexed Antony, and he set about besieging the city. Now distrustful of Octavian, Antony began to form an alliance with Sextus Pompey against Octavian Caesar. Another great civil war seemed inevitable as Antony attacked from the east with an army and Sextus attacked from the sea to the west. Octavian sought no aggression against Antony, but sent Agrippa to fight Sextus Pompey. And Marcus Agrippa succeeded in repelling Sextus's attacks, and this gave the centurions of both Octavian and Antony's legions the opportunity to bring the two triumvirs together in late 40 BCE. When Octavian and Antony met, the two triumvirs discussed terms and the complicated series of events that had almost made them enemies once more. The two decided on peace, and also a new power settlement of the Second Triumvirate. And as gestures of friendship, Octavian gave his sister Octavia to be Antony's new wife, and Antony divulged information about high-ranking officials who were plotting against Octavian. Amidst the marriage and peace celebrations, the two also decided on a new territorial agreement. Before I get to that important settlement, you might be curious about what triumvir Marcus Lepidus has been up to. And the simple answer is, not much. He had been accused of sending information and supplies to Sextus Pompey shortly after Philippi, but Octavian had found Lepidus not guilty. Nevertheless, Lepidus's power had been greatly diminished, and his natural passivity allowed Octavian to essentially control the elder Lepidus. And it also happened that Lepidus was not at this territorial settlement. And the settlement stated that Antony was to continue controlling the east, and Octavian was to control the entirety of the west, with the dividing line being midway through the province of Illyria. Oh, and Lepidus was to continue governing the province of Africa. The settlement also noted that Octavian would pursue either war or peace with Sextus Pompey, and Antony would do the same with the Parthians. Now, in the last bit of this episode, I will detail Octavian Caesar's struggle with Sextus Pompey, otherwise known as the Sicilian Revolt or sometimes the War of Sicily. After the peace settlement between Octavian and Antony, the calendar shifted to the year 39 BCE, and the renegade general and admiral that was Sextus Pompey increased the pressure on Octavian. Pompeius used his fleet to disrupt all Roman sea commerce and terrorize the coastlines of all Roman territory, especially Italia. This meant that the economy was once more faltering, but also that grain shipments were not being sent throughout the Republic. The city of Rome was starving as a result, and this forced Octavian and Antony to form a treaty with Pompeius. In this settlement, the piracy was to be halted. Pompeius would govern Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and sections of the Peloponnese, and there would be peace between all three of them. This peace, though, lasted only a period of months because Octavian and the people claimed that the piracy had not stopped, and Antony noted that the taxes from the Peloponnese had not been given to him as promised. Once Octavian suspected that Pompeius had broken the treaty, he moved swiftly against him, so quick in fact that not even Antony was informed. Octavian seized Corsica, Sardinia, and 3 legions of Pompey's through subterfuge and the desertion of Minodorus. Minodorus was the governor of the 2 islands, and he turned everything under his authority over to Octavian. Caesar then took a fleet and moved his forces to Sicily against Sextus Pompey. This conflict took place in late 39, early 38 BCE, and the tensions between Pompeius and Octavian were exacerbated even further when Octavian divorced his second wife Scribonia, who was also Pompeius' sister-in-law, in favor of his longtime wife Livia Drusilla. And it also happened that the divorce was finalized the day Scribonia gave birth to Julia, Octavian's only natural child. That day, if you're curious, was recorded as January 17th, 38 BCE. But Octavian's preemptive attack was a series of disasters, and he lost 2 separate naval engagements off the coast of Sicily. This forced Octavian to reevaluate and to coordinate his efforts with Marc Antony. After difficult negotiations, the two agreed to continue the war and exterminate Sextus Pompey, and Antony agreed to give Octavian a fleet of 120 ships in exchange for 20,000 legionnaires from Octavian. Antony hoped to use these legionnaires in a future war against Parthia. The deal was struck, and with his new fleet, Octavian moved against Sextus Pompey to finish the struggle once and for all. The conflict would take another 2 years, however, and Octavian appointed his capable friend Marcus Agrippa once more, this time as his chief admiral and general. Still, the early portion of the Sicilian Revolt was brutal, and Caesar's forces were beset with bad luck. They lost many men and ships due to bad weather, and Sextus Pompey successfully held his own in 37 BCE. The next and final year of the war showed the resilience of Octavian's forces and Agrippa's military brilliance. Caesar's forces attacked Sicily from 3 different directions, Octavian and Agrippa leading the brunt, with Lepidus attacking south from Africa. Agrippa led Octavian's fleet in 2 massive engagements against Sextus Pompey at Mylae and now Locos. both decisive victories. And at last Sextus Pompey was defeated in early September 36 BCE. Pompeius fled or was executed soon after, and at long last Octavian Caesar held full, undisputed control over the Roman West. It was then time for Octavian to hand over 20,000 legionnaires to Antony. But Octavian was already planning his next moves, and turned over only 2,000 legionnaires to Marc Antony, who was in dire straits in his war with Parthia. This betrayal foreshadowed the two Roman leaders' future relationship, and that is also where I end this episode of Everything History. And if you have any questions, comments, or corrections, send them my way at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.